Hi, my name is Justin Rhodes, and my subject is the Montgomery bus boycott, which occurred from December 1st, 1955 to December 20th of 1956. Now, the first question people want to know is, what was it? Well, the Montgomery bus boycott, by definition, was a protest and struggle against segregation laws, specifically directed at the transportation system. So the first thing we do is analyze the basic history behind such events. In this case, racial segregation is something that has occurred in the United States since the 18th century, when slave trade was established, and through inequalities such as the Chinese railroad labor, which occurred later in the 19th century. So, according to Rothenberg in Race, Class, and Gender, the doctrine of white supremacy used to support the institution of slavery was so much a part of American custom and policy that the Supreme Court in 1857 approvingly concluded that both the North and South regarded slaves as being an inferior order. This is important context simply because it establishes the mindset that people had established for decades upon decades throughout their families. Another thing to take into consideration was the establishment of Jim Crow laws, which was a list of segregation laws enforcing ideals such as separate but equal. Montgomery, Alabama adopted the idea of establishing separate but equal between blacks and whites on city liners such as buses and basic transportation. An important court event to consider is the Brown v. Board, which in 1954 the Supreme Court declared that separate schools was unconstitutional. This was significant because a lot of black communities back in the day considered that this also applied to buses. It also dismissed the ideal of separate but equal amongst institutions as well. Now, the NAACP, otherwise known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is also important as it is one of the primary factors in protests such as the Montgomery bus boycott. For example, they sponsored the boycott and incorporated people such as Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. Now, a lot of people would consider that Rosa Parks was key to starting the Montgomery boycott. On December 1st, 1955, she was actually arrested when she refused to give up her seat to a white male. Another figure to consider was Martin Luther King Jr., who was a clergyman and civil rights activist during the whole 1950s and 60s. He was famous for nonviolent methods of protest, and eventually he was elected president of the Montgomery Improvement Association. By the fourth day of the boycott, Martin Luther King decided to negotiate with city officials. However, instead, they decided to counter the boycott by raising taxi fares. This stopped a lot of black people from being able to travel to work, or in some cases, be able to travel at all. The black community established what was called a private transportation committee in order to counter this effect, in which case those black members with cars would be able to transport their fellow black Americans to their job locations. As the boycott continued, violence and arrest continued to rise. On January 30th, 1956, Martin Luther King's home was bombed, but fortunately no one was injured. High arrest rate and minor violations also ensued, such as jaywalking and minor trafficking. In fact, Martin Luther King was even recorded to have been arrested for going 30 in a 25-mile-per-hour zone. After months of boycotting and armed with the Brown decision, blacks proceeded to federal court. The Montgomery city defended their claims that integration would lead to violence. Despite this defense, at a vote to 2-1, the court favored blacks and declared that segregation on buses was just as unconstitutional as segregation in institutions and schools. On December 21st, 1956, blacks finally returned to buses and became a launch point for the civil rights movement. Alan Johnson stated in Privilege, Power, and Indifference that removing what silences them and stands in their way can tap an enormous potential of energy for change. By itself, the Montgomery victory was pretty small, but in the long run, it also sparked other movements such as the civil rights movement of 1960s and eventually leading to full desegregation of the entire nation. To conclude, I'd like to end with the words that Bradford Hall stated in Among Cultures, where he says, "Knowledge is power, and as our intercultural knowledge grows, we are empowered or freed in many practical ways. For example, we are freed from making choices out of ignorance. Instead, we are free to make choices that allow us to act both effectively and appropriately in our daily lives. These choices may relate to the social, personal, business, or political spheres of our lives. As we learn about our differences and the sense behind them, we can escape the circle of blame and conflict to which ignorance of these differences so often leads." And that concludes my presentation on the Montgomery boycott. I'd like to thank my instructor, Mrs. Powell, and my fellow students of Multicultural Communication. Thank you.